welcome into this week's book club episode for Star Wars Most Wanted by Rae Carson. We are looking at this book 2 chapters at a time, breaking down the themes and happenings and really just the character detail, because the characterization in this book has been a high point in an already great book. And we're just looking at it and having some fun with this book club. So if you haven't been here before, if you want to go back to the beginning, you can go ahead and click here, and it will take you back to our first video. But with that, we're discussing chapters 9 and 10 today. We're moving right along, and I have a lot to say. I took a whole page of notes on just chapter 9, because a lot of stuff was going on here. So let's go ahead and jump in. Chapter 9 is Qi'ra and Han and Solo have gotten to Qi'ra's hideout in the silo area, and they finally have a moment to like rest and talk, and they have a little bit of safety. And Qi'ra, it's really good that this first impression of the ship, we're in Qi'ra's POV, that we're seeing how she sees it. So she's nervous to show this hideout to these two people who, I mean, they're kind of the closest thing she has to friends, but she doesn't really have friends. She's not really convinced she can trust them. And this is the most deepest, secretest part of herself that she would never want to tell anyone, and now she's kind of forced to see how these two people are going to respond to it just because they're trying to stay alive. She describes as they're about to go into the ship that even one person knowing about the secret changes everything. And this is an important distinction. I mean, the difference between 1 and 2 people isn't necessarily very large. The difference between 2 and 3 people is not necessarily large. But the difference between 0 and 1 is astronomical. I mean, it's not really even calculable mathematically, right? How you can't double 0 because 0 is 0. And I think if anybody has ever had either a secret or something they've held really close to their chest, especially if it's something deep, you know, something that's a part of your identity, that threshold between just saying it out loud to someone or letting someone see it is a lot. And it can, depending on how the first experience go, become easier after you've done it one time. But, you know, after you've done it once, after you've said it once, after you've shown it once, it's shown, it's happened, versus having told no one. And I feel like I'm just talking in circles and reiterating the point, but that was just, even though I've never shown somebody a secret hideout, like I've been there before, I've felt that about something before, like that first plunge is kind of the scariest one, because you don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know how the person's going to respond or react, and you don't have either a good foundation to fall back on, or at least the knowledge of how it feels when it goes badly. That kind of nebulous fear of the unknown that freaks us out as people. And then once they get inside the ship, we stay with Qi'ra's POV, and again, she's very relatable to me, at least, in how she sees what's going on inside. So she is convinced that Han and Solo are either gonna not like it, or think it's dumb, or think that she's not like good at making the thing, even though they're like, this is awesome, this is cool. It's not really registering, and so she's entering this space that she loves so much, that she's cared about so much, that has been near and dear to her heart. And for somebody like Qi'ra, a space like this is metaphorical, both within the story space, but probably also for her personally, for herself. So she's showing herself to people for the first time. And you take this thing that you're so proud of and you love so much, and you show it to somebody, and suddenly the flaws become so real. I know, like, I've shown people, something I've written, a video I've made, something I was really, really proud of, and then once I show it to them, I'm like, oh, but this part wasn't good, and that part, well, and I know why this isn't good, or I like, every time I edit these videos, I'm like, oh, my sound sucks because I don't use a good microphone, because I haven't bought a good microphone. And those things can just become so strong and so intense when you're actually trying to look at it objectively, only it's this kind of like overcorrection of objectivity of it being like, oh, it must be horrible, and then not even necessarily trusting people's motives. So then Sulo offers to say like, hey, if you don't have power in here, I can help you get some power, and it would spruce things up. And is he saying that because he doesn't like the space and he's already trying to fix your thing, which is then representing you. Or Qi'ra specifically says that feeling of when someone wants to do something nice for you, but you don't know if there's strings attached. And that's another thing that I think is really relatable. I don't know how many times I've had somebody that I don't know super well who's like, hey, I can do something for you. And I'm like, are you doing this because you want something out of me? Are you doing this because you have some sort of hidden agenda or intentions for me? And she's having to go through all of this all at once. This showing her space, her safety, her physical safety location that no one else knew about to people who are effectively rivals, but then also the implications of what that means for herself. And she's just juggling a lot in this moment, and I thought it was really beautifully written, and something that I could really follow along with what she's processing. I also liked how she mentions that she felt like Han and Sulo's opinion mattered to her, and she wasn't sure why. And I think that can go to any time anyone has ever had to share something with someone, right? That sometimes it's not you sharing it with your best friend or a family member, that somehow a stranger's opinion can mean the world to you. And it's just that, again, kind of like human condition thing where we are drawn to wanting connection and affirmation from people. Sometimes, especially from people that we shouldn't want it from. And I don't know, I appreciated being in her headspace throughout this part of the story. From here, we move on to hearing Sulo's story, his past, that he and his brother were from a very well-to-do family on Coruscant. They went on a business trip with their family. Their parents passed in a freak accident, and so he and his brother were kind of left on Corellia. They had money to make it, and then Sulo's brother basically sold it all to have a really nice racing speeder, and that's where the animosity had come from in the previous chapters. Sulo is telling his story, and Qi'ra, I think, is feeling sympathetic to him telling his secrets. She says, or she thinks a line here of, when you have nothing, secrets are everything. I think that's true for a lot of people, and I think it's especially true for Qi'ra. And so now where we're going in this chapter is we're seeing more insights to Kira's path, Sulo's path, and eventually Han's. Just like we kind of learned about their secrets when they were in Paulo's house, now all of that is getting really fleshed out. But while Qi'ra is sympathetic to Sulo and sharing his secrets, she's a little bit jealous of his background and upbringing, thinking about how if she had, had at least a decent foundation, a decent childhood, that she could have at least been well nourished in her formative years, that she could survive where she's at so much better now. Thankfully, she does keep that to herself. I don't think she's wrong for feeling that way at all. It's certainly something valid. I don't know that's something that Sulo necessarily needs to hear. Comparing two people's tragedies and two people's traumas is never really fair, but how people respond to it, as long as they're not like lashing out and hurting somebody because of it, is always important to understand and consider. Even to have this like heartfelt, in-depth look at these characters' stories and where they came from and what's going on, but then to kind of have like the rawness to show how they might feel about each other. What's going on here is still kind of a tenuous, rough alliance with a lot of feelings going on. Even little lines like that about Qi'ra, which could, to somebody who's not being sympathetic to the story, make Qi'ra look bad, and I put that in quotes, that she's being selfish or that she's not, the grass is always greener. And the grass is always greener, but just to have the boldness to write a character with jealousy, because I think that even though all humans feel jealousy, and we struggle with it, it's also something that we all really turn against really fast. And so giving jealousy as a character trait to somebody you're trying to make a sympathetic character is always kind of a risk. But I thought it was done well for somebody like Qi'ra, who would struggle with jealousy because a lot of us do. A lot of us do. At this point, Sulo goes out to take first watch out at the speeder, which leaves Han and Qi'ra alone. Qi'ra apologizes for insisting on driving when she should have let Han do so. She just assumed she knew enough to be able to do it, which is a big thing from her. I don't know that she necessarily knew how good of a driver Han was, but she was making that salvo of like, hey, whoops. And then Han responds with, "Man, you're different from so many people. You know, you actually admit that you're wrong." And she's not sure how to take that statement. And it probably doesn't help that Han is Han, and is gruff and blunt about things and doesn't put any kind of nuance in when he's saying something like that. If he's trying to charm you, maybe, but not when he's just making small talk, you know. And she takes it as a "you're not like other girls" comment, which is probably something she gets a lot. I mean, Qi'ra is a nice looking lady, stuck in not a nice area, and she probably, I mean, probably has those worries. Especially because Han is a charmer. And Han's like, "No, I just am used to people arguing for the sake of arguing, and I'm not used to people owning up to it." Qi'ra says that it would be impractical to do so, and Han's like, "Well, you're never impractical." And they're having this nice moment between the two of them, and then it then comes the life talks where Han's like, "Okay, well, you're the one who's never impractical. Why would you have your hideout in literally the worst area in the city?" Qi'ra is not necessarily big on answering these questions, but she kind of does anyway. And she talks about how she's from the silo. She's from the part of town that's even worse than the White Worms, and she wanted to build something here. One, because she knows the area, but she wants to remember where she's from. She wants to remember what she's able to kind of like brought herself out of so far, with a line of, you know, "I remember that it got better once, it can get better again," which is like a strangely cynical hopefulness. I don't really know how to describe it, but I guess it's the type of thing you would have if you were in this type of situation. Han then makes a comment about how, you know, he's so thrilled that she's bad at driving, that she's bad at something, that she's so good at everything. And Qi'ra is still not quite sure how to take the line. Is it an insult? Is he still flirting? But she's kind of left to navigate just what does Han Solo mean when he says anything. But she settles on and hoping that this is a sign of respect, that he's at least trying to express that. She then takes the opportunity to turn the conversation on its head and ask him about his background. Han starts with a fib, and then goes into something that could be a fib and could not be a fib, but then ultimately settles on he has a speeder, he wants a speeder because he doesn't believe he's ever gonna fly. And for those of us who know Han Solo and know how much of a pilot he is, the thought of Han Solo thinking he's never gonna fly is a very sad and tragic thought indeed. He falls asleep, Qi'ra goes to as well. Up at the end of the chapter, it says that she looks at him, someone she hardly knows, in her secret place, and is glad that he's there. And I thought that was a really sweet moment at the end, that she had all this stress, and certainly still has some stress about letting people into her, you know, unknown, or her hidden away place, her safety net, and that it's going well. And of course, we know that Han and Qi'ra eventually end up in a relationship. So the way a lot of this is being described is, I wouldn't necessarily describe this book as a romance novel. Like, I wouldn't necessarily describe this story as their love story, but it definitely takes into account that that's where the story is going, and it kind of gives you the seeds of what that's born out of. And I appreciate that it's born out of these nice moments and not just hormones and they're the only two not despicable people in the White Worms gang or something like that, which it easily could have been. But I like that there's this kind of bedrock and foundation being built for them for where their characters go in Solo: A Star Wars Story. But that is chapter 9. Let's go on to chapter 10. At this point, they have all rested in shifts. Han wakes up to Qi'ra making food. She had some credits stowed away, and she used it to buy them something so that they can actually eat before they go out on their journey. This chapter, we're back in Han's POV, and he's now looking around and realizing that Qi'ra has done a lot to try to make her hideaway ship look nice. That there's vased dried flowers, and that there's like a makeshift chandelier, and he realizes that she's someone who both cares a lot about this place, recognizing that this place is a lot like his speeder, and that she's also somebody who appreciates finer, more beautiful things, of course, because she hasn't been able to have them in her life. They come up with a plan to go back to the Foundry and try to find the droid Tool and contact the droid Gatra. They're really not sure what to do. They can't go back to Lady Proxima, who will just hand them over. They can't go to the Empire. They can't go to Corsac. So they figure if they go to the droid Gatra, they might be able to square away whatever happened, and it's certainly the best option they have. So they figure out how they're going to get the speeder to look good, what they're going to wear, and they head back to the foundry on Corellia and find a way to sneak in. As they're making this plan and as they kind of move towards the foundry, Han and Sulo have a conversation. We get to know a little bit more about Sulo again, talking about how they're going to need luck to have the plan work, and Sulo says he's going to pray to the Force, and Han has a line of, "You sure that's how the Force works?" Which again feels like another shout out to The Force Awakens of, that's not how the Force works. But this was an interesting conversation between the two of them. Sulo talks about how he went to a museum on Coruscant that was like this underground illegal museum that he found out about from a street preacher, and how that got shut down by the Empire, but it let him connect to the Force, and he's convinced that the Force is real, but he doesn't really know what to do with it. And Han's having this whole conversation, he's leaving Qi'ra out of it, and he's just like, alright, whatever. Han eventually says, you know, if you have something you want to pray to, it couldn't hurt, right? And I like that there's actually a line where Han's like, he was expecting Sulo to appreciate him being so gracious, and really Sulo just looks let down, which was a moment I found amusing as somebody who personally, like, I am a person of faith, and like I've had conversations with people who are not, and it's fine, you get used to it, as people get used to me, I'm sure, but it's just funny how people expect you to like respond to something they say about something that's so deep and personal to you, and then you just don't appreciate them being so gracious about it for some reason. But that's like that with anything that ties into your identity, whether it's religion or otherwise, anything that becomes like a core part of yourself. You have the things that you believe in and you identify with and mean a lot to you, and then you have the things that you have the people who either don't get that, or it's the reverse. You don't understand the thing that's so important to somebody else, and those conversations can be really rough because you're coming at something from a completely different way of being, and like respect can exist there, but you know, it's just interesting to watch Han kind of wrestle with this, and it's especially interesting knowing that Han's eventually going to have a Force-sensitive son. So even though this book is largely doing a lot for Solo, a Star Wars story, it's also just doing a lot for Han Solo, and Han Solo in the sequel trilogy, which I really appreciated. So it's again just one of those kind of like, isn't really about the story moments, but there's so many vignettes that aren't really about the story, that are just really important conversations to see people have within the Star Wars universe. They get to the foundry, they sneak in, trying to act like temp workers. There's this big distraction because some guy got his arm chopped off, and they're sneaking around, and they almost get caught, and Han's able to talk his way out of something. It's kind of funny because Qi'ra's trying to add to Han's con, and Han's internally freaking out like, oh, don't oversell it. And then afterwards, Qi'ra says a line of like, you could talk your way out of anything. And Han says that it felt like an insult, but he really wanted it to be a compliment. And I think that Han doesn't have quite the same emotional intelligence that Qi'ra has at this point, so he's kind of going through that same thing with Qi'ra that Qi'ra is going through with Han. He's just not really as aware of what's going on. Qi'ra is aware that a compliment from Han or Sulo means a lot to her right now, and I think Han is also aware of it, but he's just a little bit more indignant and mad about it, where Qi'ra is a little bit more confused. But I like seeing them both kind of wrestling with and coming to understand that. Then they find their way to where the fight had happened, the big shootout had happened a couple of chapters ago. They find the mustached guy's dead body, and it's rotting, so apparently nobody has gone back in this room for a day. They find Tool, and they're able to kind of get his brain function up and moving, and they want to start asking what they should do with the cube, what they should do, what is the droid Gatra. I skipped over this, but I really appreciated that Han called it the droid Gator earlier in the chapter. I love, as somebody who can never, took me forever to pronounce that group correctly, I love that Han can't pronounce that group correctly, and it's just one of the funniest through lines in the book. But anyway, they want to ask him questions. Tool doesn't want to open up about it, and Sulo's able to convince him because he's like, hey, the fake flamethrower thing from the racer, and he's going to give that to the droid. And that's where the chapter ends. That Tool is suddenly willing to talk, but we don't hear anything else about it. Those are really my thoughts on chapters 9 and 10. I definitely didn't mention everything worth mentioning. That was just kind of, what I'm putting in this video. So please, if there's anything I didn't mention that you loved, leave a comment letting me know. I'm always excited to talk to you guys about this book. Follow us on the socials and talk to us there, especially in our Discord server. I'd love to have people there to chat with. And next week we're going to read chapters 11 and 12, so we're going to keep up the 2 chapters a week thing. We're moving right along about half-ish way through the book, which is pretty cool. But that's what we have, and I'll talk to you guys next week.